All right. Thank you guys for coming on this very frigid night to be here. I'm really excited to talk about the anxious generation. It has been a lot of what I've been eating and sleeping and breathing for several months now. Not intentionally. I came across the book through a friend who had asked me if I'd read it, and I said no, and then I read it and I couldn't put it down. That was a lie. I didn't read it. I listened to it. So I guess there was nothing to physically put down, but I did listen to the entire thing, basically start to finish, and really jived with so much of what Jonathan Haidt, the author of the book, had to say, not only because he is outlining problems, but because he's also outlining some solutions. And I think we're all a little tired of just complaining about all the things that are wrong. And it's great to be able to start talking about all the things we can, in fact, do. So this is the big dilemma. Every time we talk about social media and smartphones with our kids, we all know they're not great for them, and yet parent after parent gives it to their kids anyway. And it's not because we don't love them, and it's not because we don't want what's best for them, and it's not because we don't care about their mental health. It's we don't want them to feel left out. That is ultimately what it boils down to. If my kid is the only kid without social media, without a smartphone, without certain Instagram or Snapchat or whatever they're using to communicate, then they're going to get ousted from their group. They're going to get left behind. And frankly, social isolation, we know with our mental health, is not a successful way to go either. And so this is the choice that we're left with. Either give them a phone and let them do the things that we don't think are great for them, or not give them a phone and fear that they are going to be socially isolated. And what I really want to talk about today is, what if we didn't have to choose? What if those were not our options and there was a different way to go about this? And I think it's easier to conceptualize that solution as parents of younger kids. They don't have phones yet. Their friends don't have phones yet. We can envision banding together to make that happen. It's harder to envision as parents who have kids who do already have phones and social media. And let's be very real, we are not going to just strip those things away entirely tonight when we come home and be done with it. But there are, without question, solutions that we can propose there too for how to manage the problem, how to make it less impactful on their mental health. So we'll talk about that. What Jonathan Haidt refers to as the Great Rewiring of Childhood is really this movement from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And you'll see on my next slide that a lot of what we're talking about happens when the iPhone is introduced, or a couple of gens later of the iPhone and all the things that came along with it. But the problem actually starts earlier than that. We started shifting away from a play-based childhood right around the 80s and 90s. And then the phone was sort of the accelerant to a problem that was already existing. And so here's a bit of the timeline on this great rewiring. We've got 2007, the first iPhone drops, and 2008, the App Store opens. In 2009, the like button is introduced. So are things like retweets and shares and ways that we can communicate with each other through these different social media sites so that we can seek more validation. We can get more likes, we can get more shares, and we start to care about that. And the other interesting thing that statistics are showing was really relevant, especially for mental health and especially for girls, was in 2010 when the first smartphone came out that had a front-facing camera. So now we have selfies. Then what happens? Everyone starts to get one of these and they start to purchase these apps. And between 2010 and 2015, we get what we really describe as the surge of suffering. And what that means is there was truly a tidal wave of anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide. The mental health of our youth in particular just absolutely tanked in that time period in a way that really can't be described and explained by any other theory. There was nothing else that happened in that exact time period in multiple countries and multiple places that could explain that problem. And here's the scary stuff. I'm going to give you 2 scary slides, and then we're going to try to move away from the scary and into some more hopeful conversation. But what Haidt refers to and what many researchers refer to here is the hockey stick data, and you can see why. There is a very incremental increase in things like anxiety and depression prior to 2010, but really things are fairly steady. And then if you look at the gray area right there on these ones, and then the next two graphs that I'll show you, that's 2010 to 2015. And you can see that right around that time, there is just a shooting up of all of these different issues. And so that one on the left is major depressive episodes in teenagers. The one on the right is the prevalence of anxiety. And you can see that for most age ranges, it's going up. When you're right around that 50 age range, it actually didn't seem to have much of an impact at all. And then, of course, the younger you were when you were introduced to these things and getting your first phone, those are the ones that were impacted the most. And then these graphs over here, we have emergency room visits for self-harm, and we also have suicide rates in adolescents. And these are pretty scary statistics across the board. There is no doubt about that. There are people that are a little bit critical of some of this research and data, and they'll say things like, yeah, but aren't we just becoming more mental health conscious than we used to be? And so people are talking about it more. Maybe there isn't more anxiety and depression. Maybe we're just seeking treatment more often and things like that. But when you compare not only the self-reported data, but also things like how many people are dying, how many people end up in hospital rooms, you can't explain it through other means. And so here we are tonight to first understand the problem, because occupational hazard, as a neuropsychologist, knowledge is power. And the more we really understand about why this is happening and what's really going on, the more empowered we can be to do something about it. And so the way we'll talk about that is in two pieces. The first piece is overparenting in the real world. And then the second piece is underparenting online. All right, so let's talk a little bit. I had to temper myself here, but we'll talk a little bit about childhood and the brain. So children's brains grow to 90% of their full size by age 5. They do a lot of brain growing very early on, but that's the size and structure of the brain. It is not the functions of the brain. The functions of the brain continue to develop for many years. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex, which is that emotion control center of the brain, that's what allows us to problem solve and control our impulses and plan and actively work towards reaching long-term goals. That doesn't develop until what we thought was the early 20s. And now research is suggesting that it's actually the late 20s. And until that prefrontal cortex is online and fully developed, kids are often making decisions with their amygdala. That is the emotion center of the brain. So they are not thinking first, they are feeling first. And anyone that is a parent to a child of any age very much knows that. My 3-year-old is very good proof of that on a daily basis right now. And I think one of the most important things to know about brain development in children's brains is that they learn through experience. And their brains are extremely malleable. They are adjusting and changing constantly. And what they are exposed to really helps to wire the way that they're going to be later on. So the question is, what kinds of experiences should they be having when they're children? If we know that we can kind of help to adjust that brain and help it grow in healthy ways, what does that actually look like? And one of the most important things for kids is free play. It is really and truly essential for their development. It helps them develop social skills. It helps them develop a sense of independence and autonomy. It helps them learn how to navigate difficult situations, how to cope with negative emotions when they get frustrated with something, how to work through problems. There is so much that happens with free play. A couple of other things that are really critical during childhood. One is getting synchronous socialization. And what that means is social interactions that are in real time, back and forth, having to actually navigate a problem and a conversation with somebody else, as opposed to perhaps being able to get a text that upsets you and then ignore the person for 5 hours and maybe forget about them for the rest of your life because you've decided that they're canceled and now we don't have to solve this problem. And so getting those face-to-face opportunities is essential, along with embodied experiences. As humans, we are embodied creatures. We experience through our full selves with eye contact and body language and gestures and tone of voice and all the different things that we use as cues and clues to figure out what the other person is feeling, how we can react to that in response. And so not getting those personal bodily experiences can be really difficult. And then I mentioned this before, but it's a huge one, this idea of taking risks. We have to take risks in order to know what's an okay and safe and appropriate risk to take and what's not. That's how we learn. We learn by climbing a little higher, and then maybe we fall down, but oh, I didn't actually get that hurt. I can climb that high again. But if we're constantly telling them, be careful, watch out, because we want to protect our kids and we want them to be safe and we don't want them to get hurt, but taking risks is so essential to their success. And so there's this idea of, in childhood, we want to be in discover mode, but oftentimes we are actually in defend mode. And what that means is we want kids feeling like the goal here is let me grow, and that what we're doing is helping to foster that for them, as opposed to keep me safe, which really shuts their world down into a much smaller place where they start to feel like the world is unsafe and unpredictable and scary. And that, of course, we can see can lead to all kinds of anxiety and other outcomes later. But what's happened is we've got this decline of play-based childhood. Like I said, it started around the 80s and 90s. And I joke that part of the issue is that we overschedule our kids. And here I am overscheduling this slide. But there are so many different things I wanted to throw on here to acknowledge. So one of the changes that has happened in the past several decades is that there was this big push for a greater emphasis on education, grades, academics. We started to fear our kids weren't faring well enough compared to kids from other fully developed nations. And so the school day got longer and homework got longer. And so there was less time to even play if we wanted to. And tied with that, all this competition around getting into the right college. And what is the right college? Oh, it's only one of these 10. And if it's anything else, then you're not going to be successful. And with that comes overscheduling our kids and trying to push towards what's going to look good on their applications for college. And all of that really takes away from their free time and their chance to really engage in the free play that they need to be successful. The other thing that was happening simultaneously is this culture of safetyism. And so that's the be careful, be careful, be careful. But safetyism really means valuing safety above all else in our parenting. Do we want our kids to be safe? Absolutely. But how are we defining safe? Are we really defining it by like, hey, we don't want them to run through a really busy street and get hit by a car? Reasonable amount of safetyism right there. But when we take that to a really entirely other level, what we're doing is we are stopping them from building independence. We don't want them walking to school, or we need to know where they are at all times. And we are checking them on Life 360, and we are, texting them every couple of minutes to make sure that they're okay. I don't know. I'm sort of in this middle generation, but my dad tells me stories about how he would come home from school and drop his backpack and then just go run out on the streets with his friends until it was dark outside. Nobody had any idea where anybody else was. They were playing pickup games of ball. They were having the time of their lives. They were not being coached. They were not being scrutinized. They were not being told that their worth was dependent on how good they were at whatever activity they were playing. They were just being kids. And childhood really doesn't look like that at all anymore. And sometimes I think about it, I'm like, oh, easy solution. I'll just stop scheduling my kid and I'll let him like run around on the street and play. And then we kind of look out the window and it's like, who would he play with though, right? And that's a really big thing that Haidt talks about in all aspects of this, is that this problem, both the overparenting in the real world and the underparenting online, they are community problems. They are very different than pretty much any other parenting decision we ever have to make. How many vegetables we feed our kids during the day, what time they go to bed, if they have to bathe every night or every other night. It doesn't matter what other parents are doing. You can make those decisions independently and you'll be fine. These pieces though, is my kid going to get left out, or are other kids playing on the street, or is my kid the only one who doesn't have a phone? Now it matters what everybody else is doing around us so that we can make the decisions that we want to be able to make. I do want to say that statistically, the world is actually safer than it really ever has been by way of crime rates and by way of, children getting kidnapped and like all the things that we were ultimately so afraid of when we started to shift away from this free range childhood that it's being called now. I put that milk carton picture up because that is part of what started this trend, that suddenly a couple of kids went missing, which is pretty much the scariest thing that you can imagine happening to you as a parent about your child. And it's on your breakfast table every day. And you're seeing these faces and you're totally freaking out. And you're making decisions based on emotion, even though rationally and statistically, the likelihood that that would actually happen to your child is, so much lower than the likelihood that, like, God forbid, they could get into a car accident anytime they're in a car with you, but we didn't stop driving. But we don't make rational decisions sometimes when we're parents. We make emotional decisions. And so part of this is this fear that the world really has become more unsafe when we know statistically that is not true. And so this one was just fun here. But for the record, if for some strange reason you did want your child to be kidnapped by a stranger, how long would you have to keep them outside unattended for this to be statistically likely to happen? 750,000 years. But we don't think like that when we're parents sometimes. All right, and this is just one of my very favorite quotes from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. He says, just as the immune system must be exposed to germs and trees must be exposed to wind, children require exposure to setbacks, failures, shocks, and stumbles in order to develop strength and self-resilience. Overprotection interferes with this development and renders young people more likely to be fragile and fearful as adults. And so there is lots more to talk about here about overparenting, but two places that I can lead you are, one, a fantastic documentary called Chasing Childhood that I recommend everybody watch. It is now available, I think, for $5. You have to rent it, and it is a very worthwhile watch. The other one is the Let Grow Project. This is a project started, I believe, actually by Jonathan Haidt and Lenore Skenazy. And she is a journalist who, and she's highlighted in the Chasing Childhood documentary, a journalist who lives in New York and who let her 9-year-old son ride the subway by himself one day and didn't think it was a big deal. She was just like, he said he was ready and we've taken the subway a million times, so I let him take the subway. And so she mentioned it to a couple of her friends and they were all looking at her like, you did what? And so eventually she decided a couple months later to write an article about her kid's experience riding the subway by himself at age 9. And I think the next day she was on The Daily Show and I think Oprah, all these shows and in every article, and she was being called all kinds of things. But through that, I think she realized how much we had shifted away from building independence in our kids. And so she started this Let Grow project, which is really designed to help bring things back to building independence in your children. An example of the homework, by the way, which I love, is this question right here. And I can give you that homework tonight, which is go home and ask your kid, what is one thing that you feel ready to do on your own that for one reason or another, you just haven't done yet? And then talk to them about it and come up with something that feels comfortable to both of you and let them do it. The thing about anxiety that we're not really only talking about kids' anxiety, we're actually also talking about our anxiety as parents. We're often way more afraid to let them do these things than they are. And the antidote to anxiety is exposure. And so the more that we do these things that scare us, the more that we let our child ride his bike to the other side of town to go meet up with a friend and not check their whereabouts, and then let them come back home that day and realize they survived, the less anxious we will be, the more comfortable we will get continuing to engage in those experiences. Under parenting online. Here we go. Teens report spending an average of 7 hours per day on screens, not including any time that they are actually using them for learning and homework and education. And I was just listening to a podcast, and it sounds like most updated research says that the average has actually moved to 8 or 9 hours a day. That raises a lot of questions. What are they doing online? What are they not doing because they're spending all of their time online? And I think there are so many different things to unpack here, but none of them are particularly great for their mental health. So I'm coming back to the brain, but very quickly I want to talk about puberty in the brain, because this is a time of development where extremely rapid brain change is happening. There is tons of rewiring going on. And what we know is that neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is that the more repetition that we get with things, the more succinct they get, the more successful and efficient we get at them, and the easier they are to do. So that's why we do a lot of practicing. If you want to become a great pianist, if you are an artist, if you are practicing a sport and you're in your backyard spending hours a day, working on your golf swing, the more you do it, the more you practice, the better you get. It can also work in the inverse, though. If we are spending all of our time doing things like, scrolling and multitasking and demanding our attention in 40 places at once, which is neurologically impossible to actually do, then we're training our brain to not be able to focus on things for long periods of time, to not be able to really engage with depth into things that we would want them to. So the brain is really vulnerable to the effects of stressors. And that's part of what's happening when we think about what are they being exposed to online. Sometimes it's innocent content, and sometimes it's not. I mean, we know certainly with algorithms and a lot of what is being fed to our kids, the more they're seeing about what the perfect body is supposed to look like and what other people are doing that looks so perfect, and the more that they start to doubt themselves or develop that negative self-confidence, we're kind of building their brain to be more susceptible to that as well. And I thought this one was a really interesting statistic. So on average, age 14 is the time that the brain really develops skepticism. And so what does that mean in the context of this conversation? It means that before that time, they don't really have the capacity to critically analyze and maybe doubt or question the content that they're being fed. And so they are much more likely to just believe it to be true. And we know where that can go. Jonathan Haidt talks about 4 main foundational harms that smartphones and social media are causing for our kids. And so we'll break those down now. The first one is social deprivation. So this refers to the amount of time spent daily with friends is way less than it used to be. I think it was in 2003, the statistic was, it was right around 2.5 hours a day spent with your peers, face-to-face, in person, not including class time. And that number by 2019 had dropped to 40 minutes, from 2.5 hours to 40 minutes per day on average. Kids are not required to handle their social problems and work through things, as we talked about. They can just ignore somebody. They can respond later. They can text 17 other friends and ask how they should respond to this terrible text that they got. But they don't have to actually real-time navigate those challenges. and they're not getting those synchronous and embodied experiences that we said are so critical for their development when they're younger. They're also reporting being way lonelier, which is interesting because we think about, Facebook coming out initially, and it was like, wow, you get to be super connected to all of your friends wherever they are all the time. This is so great. We're all going to feel way more connected. But it is without question having the opposite effect, because those kinds of interactions don't fill our need for connection. So they are absolutely reporting feeling significantly lonelier than they used to. The second one is sleep deprivation. Those like 7 to 9 hours on average a day that they're spending on their phones, not engaging in schoolwork. Guess what some of that is eating up from? Time to sleep. They are not sleeping as much. They are getting woken up by notifications. They are, doom scrolling in the middle of the night when they should be rolling back over. And it is very clear that kids are just not getting the amount of sleep that they need in order to thrive. And with a lack of sleep comes a million other issues. Sleep helps regulate us. It regulates our attention. It regulates our emotions. It regulates our behavior. It allows us to be able to successfully study and perform and do the things we need to do. And it allows us to just be our best, most calm selves. So we know that ain't good. The third one is attention fragmentation, and this is the one that is a thorn in the side of all neuropsychs everywhere these days, which is parents coming in and calling and saying, I think my kid has ADHD. It's like, why do you think your kid has ADHD? Because they can't focus on anything, and they're saying they're easily distracted and they can't pay attention in class, and it's a great question. Now we have to dig a little further. When did this start? Did the kindergarten and first grade teacher notice this? Is this only an issue in high school? And what we are seeing without question is that the number of kids being referred for ADHD evals, thinking that they have ADHD, is like doubled, tripled in the past decade or so. And it's not that they are wrong. It's not like they're lying when they say that they're having trouble paying attention. They literally cannot pay attention anymore. They are training their brain to be unable to sustain their focus for lengthy periods of time. On average, a person gets 250 notifications a day. There is no time that we are just locked in that Zen place and in our flow and doing the things that we need to do to really master any kind of skill that we want to master and accomplish anything that we really want to accomplish. And certainly we know that can interfere with academics and whatnot. There are some schools around here that have gone phone free, at least during like in class time, and they've now got phones in the pockets. And students and teachers alike will say it's ridiculous how different the classroom is when actually nobody is on their phone, how much more engaged they are, how much more they've learned, how much less they have to study because they actually absorbed the information the first time when they were sitting in class. So these things are no joke, but the question is it foundationally a neurodevelopmental problem, or is it something that they've developed later on? And then the last one that he talks about is addiction. And this one is one of the trickiest because are we talking like lowercase a addiction or capital A addiction? I think we can all say we're addicted to our phones, and I will absolutely admit to that. When he's talking about addiction, he's talking about a very real sort of clinical level of addiction, which statistics are saying about 14% of people are truly addicted to the point that they are like unable to function without access to their phones. It is having a significant adverse impact on their academic performance, their occupational performance, their social engagement. But even if you're not in the category of capital A addiction, we all know that we are to a degree addicted. And what's happening is that dopamine is being released in your brain when you get that like, or a bunch of people have shared what you've sent, or you find something that's really stimulating and exciting and it's hitting exactly the thing that they know you want to see. But the thing about dopamine hits is it's not like you get one and then you're good and now you can go do something else for a while. It is never satiating. And so you got to keep coming back for more and more and more and more with really no end in sight. Those are what he talks about. I think there's many more that, of course, he gives a nod to and that lots of people are talking about as well. But these are some of those additional harms where, what about what they're actually being exposed to? I mean, part of it is they're being exposed to whatever is happening politically and environmentally and, internationally in our world, sometimes at ages and stages where they're not ready for that information. Their brains are truly not ready to absorb it, and yet they're being exposed to it anyway. And then, of course, we've got the algorithms, and we know that things like self-harm and eating disorder, encouraging kinds of content exist. And then porn is another very big one. 8 is now the average age of first exposure to porn. And to be clear, it is not because most 8-year-olds are seeking it out, it's finding them. The amount of social and relational aggression and drama and challenges that our girls in particular, but certainly our boys too, are having is pretty tremendous. And then this idea of really the emphasis on external validation. That's something that as teenagers we're prone to anyway. We want our, first when you're young, you want your parents to approve of what you're doing and to really give you that validation. And then when you're a teenager, it shifts over to your friends and your social life, and you want to make sure that everybody else is into what you're doing and getting approval from them. But what's happening now is truly like an accelerant has been poured onto that need that maybe had already existed. And now it is this constant need to be validated by what you're putting up online and how many people are responding to it, and making yourself look better and better and using every filter that you can in ways that are detracting from any ability for people to look inward and go, do I really care how many likes I get, or is what's inside of me actually what matters? How do I find that internal validation? How do I figure out what's important to me and what I value and what kind of person I want to be? But there isn't even time for that kind of reflection anymore, because 7 to 9 hours a day on average on their phones. The question now is, what do we do? And Jonathan Haidt proposes 4 different solutions. The first one is no smartphones before high school. And emphasis on the smart part of smartphones. I think it's really important to distinguish there, because he's not saying phones are bad altogether. And especially if on one hand, we're encouraging kids to go out and run around and ride their bikes and be with other kids, and we don't really know exactly where they're going or what time they'll be home, it's okay then. Have a flip phone, have a watch where you can call people and text your parents and let them know where you are. It's the smartphones and, of course, the access to the entire internet that comes along with them that's the problem. And so now the Wait Till 8th movement has really been gaining speed all across the country. The second part is no social media before the age of 16. The third one he talks about is phone-free schools. And there's a couple of ways to go about that. I'll actually have that on the next slide in a moment. But the idea is we are recognizing that some of the problem, a large part of the problem, is at home. And it's also a problem at school, like we talked about, with attention and learning and not being able to focus on studies. And school is also a place where they are supposed to be social, when they're doing group work, when they have lunches, and even in passing periods and study halls. Nobody's talking to anybody anymore at those times. So moving towards phone-free schools is a big one. And then the last one, which he acknowledges is frankly the hardest out of all of them, is this idea of more unsupervised play and independence for our kids. Just a note here about the phone-free schools. It seems like there are 2 primary ways to go about this. So for some, it's a matter of banning phones during class time. And so the way that works, you can bring your phone into school, you come into class, you drop it in a pocket on the door, and then you're in class, and then you grab it and you have it for your passing period, and then you have to park it again when you get to your next class. Of course, I would think that is certainly better than no ban at all. But in some ways, you can sort of see the downside still too, that all those times they are supposed to be social, now they're like grabbing their phone and they haven't had it for the last hour, and so they're furiously checking whatever they have missed. But it is certainly a step in the right direction. And then the other way to go about it is bell to bell. There are no phones allowed in the school, full stop, no exceptions. And there are a couple of states that have already implemented that. And then there are 8 more states coming up to move towards these legislative actions. And I think we are hopefully going to continue to see more and more of this as we move on and as we are seeing the impact. Even if by state changes aren't being made, by district they are. And so there are lots of things that we can still do here from a school standpoint too. My very best friend in the entire world, who I grew up with in Toronto, is a mural artist. And this is a piece of a mural that she painted over the summer in Toronto. And it's like the entire city block, and it's all these gorgeous strawberries and flowers and everything, all made up out of tiny little hearts. And it says, little by little, a little becomes a lot. And I really do believe that. I am a firm believer of that. It is very hard to come into these conversations thinking like we have to change things on a state level or even on a school level, but we don't. We don't have to do that. We can make small changes, each of us, in ourselves, in our families, in our friend groups, and little by little, a little really does become a lot. I wanted to share with everybody just a couple of resources that I highly encourage that you check out. Of course, if you have not read The Anxious Generation, it is a great one. In terms of documentaries, 2 are Chasing Childhood, which I mentioned, as well as Screenagers, which has been around for a while, but I haven't actually yet seen, but I've heard that they just came out with an elementary school version of Screenagers, and I've heard that it's fantastic. The Let Grow project is Lenore Skenazy's project, which I mentioned a nearby school district is already implementing in their schools, but I think there's lots of wonderful content there just for parents to be able to use at home. I'm sure most of you have heard of Common Sense Media, which allows you to figure out with websites and apps and movies and all kinds of things what is appropriate for kids at different ages. And then I just discovered a wonderful new podcast called Raising Parents with Emily Oster. She's an economist by trade, but she offers all kinds of really cool research-based, data-driven information about parenting these days. And the first episode is actually about, are we over-parenting our kids? And it speaks to much of the same content. And I think there's 8 episodes out now. And I've really enjoyed giving it a listen. So those are the resources that I'm suggesting here. And my last thing I want you guys to leave with is just this idea again, that each heart alone is just a heart, but little by little, a little becomes a lot. And if each of us can become one of those hearts, if you can get your friends to become some of those hearts, then together I really do believe that we can free the anxious generation. So thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. What is your why for being here tonight, for having read the book if you've read it, or engaging in the content? I've put some up here, some I've added from really great conversations that I've had with lots of people. But I want you to think about it both in terms of the overparenting in the real world, the underparenting online. Anyone want to share what feels hardest or most apparent to you right now with kids these days? So the question that I pose to you is, what will you do next? I want us to either have a conversation about it, and also I have some Post-it notes and some pens here that I want everyone to just write down a couple of ideas of what they would like to do. And I want you to think big, but I really want you to think small. I want you to think about things like, we implemented a no phones at the dinner table policy at my house. Which for the record was exclusively designed for my husband and I, because our children are 1st grade and 3 years old. They do not have phones yet, but we do. And guess where they were showing up every night? At the dinner table. and it has been pretty great. It was an adjustment period. I will say, I think the first thing that happened was I realized how reliant we are on our phone, even for things that aren't scrolling social media. So like there we were, phone free, having a conversation at dinner with our children, and it was like, what are we up to again this weekend? Or can you invite this, this guy over for a play date? And I'm like, sure, let me just text the mom. And then I'm like, I don't have a phone right now. Let me check the schedule. I don't have a phone right now. He was like, Mom, what's the weather supposed to be like tomorrow? Do I have to wear my coat again? And I'm like, let me check the weather. I don't have my phone right now. And it reminded me that I think so many of our conversations are actually about what is going to happen, that we forget to just kind of talk about where we are right now. And those conversations don't need a phone. So it's been cool to see how that's morphed in my household. The next one I'm going to work on is phone-free family gatherings, because we just had some cousins over and all the teenagers just kind of walk in and they plop themselves on the couch and I didn't get one word with them. I was like, that's it. Next time we get together, we are parking our phones at the front door. And like, we're just going to actually hang out. And wouldn't that be adorable? Let's play some board games. Let's talk. But those things really are doable, and they really do make a difference. So I encourage you to think about all of them. Where phones are plugged in at the end of the day? Are they all in our bedrooms right beside our ears, making it very difficult for us to actually sleep properly? Just little and big things like that. And not only the phones. I think we really also need to be thinking about how are we encouraging more independence in our kids? Are we going to go do that let grow homework and let them do something that they've never done before on their own because they feel ready to do it, even if we don't? Are we going to maybe not schedule them for like both of those sports at the same time, so that they can maybe do one sport and have a little bit of time just to hang out, and maybe coordinate that with their friends so that there is someone else to hang out with? It really cracks me up. I feel like I'm scheduling unscheduled time. I'm like, okay, guys, group text, 10 o'clock on Sundays. We are all going to get together because our kids are going to have no activities to do and they are going to play, right? And we have to book that into our very overscheduled lives, but I think we can do that, and I think it makes a difference.